First of all, thanks for those who are attending this event in person here in beautiful Copacabana Beach in Rio de Janeiro. And I'm quite happy that my Carioca accent translates pretty well into English. As I say, beach with a strong S in the accent, so it's really nice. For those who live in Rio, for those who are from other states, it sounds a little bit strange. I'm Carlos Affonso. I'm director of the Institute for Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro. And it's a great pleasure to be with you all here. And for those who are watching us on YouTube, it's great to have you in this morning. And if you're watching this at some other point of the day, it's good to have you with us as well. So here with me is Celina Bottino. Celina is also a director from ITS Rio. And today we're going to have a discussion about the metaverse, or the metaverses, and try to understand what the metaverse is, what are the future of this new form of interaction, and what we have at stake, and how we make sure that the metaverse is as diverse and inclusive as possible. So for this discussion, we are going to bring Rob Sherman with us for this conversation. So Rob, can I ask you to take the stage here with us? So thanks, Rob. And before Celina introduces Rob, let me just say very brief words on what we're doing here today. And because it's called in Portuguese a varanda. A veranda is like balcony in English. And you might think that it's a little bit strange because it doesn't seem like we are in an actual balcony, even though we are in a rooftop, a beautiful rooftop, but like it wouldn't be a balcony. But just to explain that, so when ITS was created, we used to have a very beautiful balcony facing Flamengo Beach. And the very first events, face-to-face events that we created at ITS, we decided to call it a veranda. And then became the series of verandas events from ITS. And since we have transitioned for very different other locations, we decided to stick with the name. So we're still calling our face-to-face live events verandas. And when the pandemic ended up hitting us hard, we stick with the name. So we were used for the previous, like, almost 2 years and a half of doing the events from ITS online, keep calling it verandas. And I'm really happy to say this is our very first veranda that we are able to do it in a hybrid form. So we have the streaming running on YouTube, but at the same time, we are able to meet face-to-face, and that's incredible. It's quite emotional, actually, to be able to see each other face-to-face and to be able to be present in the same space and to see each other, to engage in this conversation that we're having today. So sorry for taking too long. This is just to tell a bit about the story of our events and that we're really happy to be able to put up this hybrid event that we have today. But without further ado, Celina, I think you're up to introduce our speaker for today.
Sure. Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction, and good morning for all of you. So I'd like to introduce Rob Sherman, who is the Vice President and Deputy Chief Privacy Officer for Policy at Meta. Since joining the company, then called Facebook, in 2012, Rob and his team have worked closely with privacy and policy experts inside and outside the company, along with product, engineering, research, and other teams to protect people's privacy across the company's suite of projects and technology. Rob has worked to develop approaches within the company and in public policy to promote the responsible development of the new technologies like artificial intelligence and augmented reality. Prior to joining the company, Rob advised technology and media companies as a lawyer at Covington Burley, and he has earned his degree at University of Michigan Law School and a BS in Human-Computer Interaction at the University of Maryland. Rob lives with his wife and 2 daughters outside Washington, D.C. And welcome. And thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So thanks, Rob. It's really a pleasure to have you with us for this conversation. And I'll kick things off with a discussion or with a question that I think it's important for everyone to be at the same page. So, Rob, as we know, there are a lot of discussion about the metaverse, but at the same time that we see a lot of people talking about the metaverse, in terms of the very concept of the metaverse, it seems like we have very different definitions, and sometimes people are talking about very different things. So even though we know that the name metaverse can be stringed back to 1992 novel, Snow Crash, that everyone talks about, but when we think about the metaverse, and especially when Meta addresses the metaverse, I think it will be quite useful for our audience to understand what the metaverse is. And together with this question comes the second one. Like, we're talking about like a one metaverse or several metaverses. So if you could introduce this topic, I think it would be an amazing start to have everyone at the same page. So what the metaverse is, and is there like a one or several metaverses that we should be talking about?
All right. Well, thank you so much for the question, and thank you both for the invitation to be here, and thank you to everybody who's joining in person and virtually on YouTube. We're about to have a conversation about the metaverse and about being together virtually, but I think there's really no substitute for being in person and being able to have these interactions. And those of us who are here in person also have a beautiful view of the beach right behind the camera. So really looking forward to that. So in terms of what I think you're absolutely right that this concept of the metaverse has gotten a lot of attention. Obviously, we renamed the company from Facebook to Meta, as you mentioned, in an effort to refocus, to be clear that we see this as the direction of travel for the company, but really for all of us, and how we are going to interact, a decade, 2 decades into the future. And so I think this question of like, what do we actually mean by the metaverse is a really important one. Mark Zuckerberg has framed it as the successor to the mobile internet. And so I think that actually it's kind of a hard concept to understand until you unpack it a little bit. But many of us are old enough to remember a time when, we didn't have phones in our pockets. Many people in the world still don't have phones in their pockets. But where the communication that we had was through landline telephone or postal mail or things like that. Like, these were, and the kind of ubiquitous communication that some people in the world experience today just wasn't a part of most people's experience. And obviously we've come quite a distance since then. But if you think about the future, and you think about what technology will deliver in the 2 decades into the future, 1 decade into the future, it is this idea of being, we might actually not be using our phones in the way that folks in this room are. There might be a different technology or different set of technologies and a different way that we interact. What do I mean by that? I think that the metaverse, I would define it as a set of technologies and experiences that are more immersive and more real-time or ephemeral than what we experience today on the internet. And so you can imagine a situation where, even though I just said I'm really happy to be here in person in Rio, you can imagine a situation where we're sitting up here and then we are actually all in 3 different locations, and you can and it looks to us where through augmented reality like we're in the same place and we can actually look at each other. And if you think, most of us have had this experience over the course of the pandemic of seeing a lot of people on video conferencing screens or a lot of people on the telephone, and you realize there's something that you miss in that interaction. And nothing is ever going to replace in-person interactions, but this idea of being able to make eye contact, the spatial audio, like the fact that I know that you're over here and you're over here, like these things make a lot of difference to human communication and the ability, the serendipity of being able to walk around together. So these things I think will be really important. Virtual spaces also will be really powerful. So for example, I was in the beginning of the pandemic, I was with my kids at home in Washington, D.C. We had hoped to travel and see the world, and we, for pandemic reasons weren't able to do it. And so we were able to travel in virtual reality to Peru, where I'm actually going soon, but to Peru, to Machu Picchu, and they were able to see one of the wonders of the world through the magic of virtual technology. And so these things I think are really powerful. They're still very, very early in the evolution of the technology. But if I would sum that up, I think what we're talking about across these different kinds of technologies, and we should talk a little bit about the uses of them and how beyond just sort of being able to sit and chat and have a conversation, they could change people's lives. But I think the core concept is one of presence, right? The ability to be somewhere where you couldn't otherwise be physically, or with people that you couldn't physically be with. And so it's also worth saying that the metaverse, most people, even though we're talking about all this new technology, and I think, hopefully we'll talk about some of what the technology is, most people in the world are for, many generations are not going to be using, high-tech headsets to access the metaverse, right? So some people will. A lot of people will be using smartphones or feature phones or tablets or computers, or, you can imagine a lot of different technologies that will be developed. And so one of the other pieces that's really important, and I think this gets to your question about is it a metaverse or metaverses, is the ability for different people to, using different technologies in different parts of the world, technologies that are built by lots of different companies, to be able to interact together, and to be able to provide that kind of access regardless of what technology or what connectivity you have. So that leads me to, is it metaverse or metaverses? I think a really important foundational concept is that for this vision to be successful, it really has to be one metaverse in the way that we talk about, the way we don't talk about, a Google internet and a Microsoft internet and a Facebook internet. We talk about the internet. And I think in the same way, if this vision is successful, you need to be able to travel from a virtual world that's created by my company to a virtual world that somebody else has created, and for those to interoperate and to interact so that you can take your avatar and your identity and move with you just the same as you can move from one website to another. So how we get there is going to be really, really challenging. But I think if we're going to build something that is as equitable as we want it to be and as meaningful in terms of improving people's lives, giving people access to educational experiences, giving people access to travel the world when they might not be able to do it, it needs to be done in a way that is interoperable and that leads to one overall vision of a metaverse as opposed to a lot of separate ones.
All right, thanks very much, Rob. And I think one thing that stands out from your answers, I think that most people, when they think about the metaverse, they think about someone with VR glasses and device in front of their faces. So I think it's quite important to make sure that when we're addressing the metaverse, we are not only referring to this specific device as the VR set, and try to understand the diverse set of devices that will be possible to access the metaverse through them, because that will lead to a question of inclusion, and I think that Celina has a question on that.
Sure, I think that's, many follow-up questions based on what you're saying. But just to start, so I think that's something from the standpoint of Global South, which is very important, access to infrastructure and the core enablers, which you just mentioned, like it's not necessarily you'll need to have like hardware, like you have to have a hardware, computer, power, internet connectivity, and access to some devices. So and that puts on like a kind of an alert here on us regarding the actual access that people will have to all these core enablers. Let's say, for example, take connectivity, right? Brazil just last week had this first city, Brasilia, to have the 5G working in the standalone mode. And there are a lot of areas which still lacks connectivity and also any kind of other devices. So how do you guys are seeing this this potential gap that the metaverse could even enlarge regarding this digital divide that's still it's something that worries us here from Global South countries?
I think it's a really critical point, and early on, last year when we first started talking in earnest about the metaverse as a direction for the company, we put out a blog post that talked about what it looks like to do that responsibly, and look at some of the lessons that we've learned from today's internet, and try to learn from them and address them up front. In terms of the evolution of the metaverse. And I think we have a real opportunity in the sense that we do have a decade or more before this kind of technology will be commonplace for most people to be able to think about that. But and to be able to work on those solutions. As a part of that, we talked about 4 big areas. I'll outline 4, but I think the last one is most relevant to your question. So we talked about privacy and data protection. We talked about safety and integrity. We talked about economic opportunity and making sure that people can earn a living in this virtual space that we are hoping to help create. And then we talked about equity and inclusion, and really making sure that we think about digital divide issues. We think about making sure that the kinds of separation that exists in our society today, that this can be a force to reduce that rather than make it more acute. So. What that means in practice is a lot of different things. One is having conversations like this and really thinking not just about what it looks like to build technology for wealthy people in wealthy countries, but what it looks like to build technology for the world. And that involves a number of different things. So one thing that you talked about is connectivity. We have to be thinking about both reducing the bandwidth constraints and the bandwidth that's needed for the technology that we're talking about. So that may mean instead of transferring a bunch of data down to a device and having it processed on the device, can we move more processing to the server and have it done that way using virtual computing? That's one way to do it. Opening up more access to spectrum for connectivity around the world, particularly in places where it's a problem today, that's going to be really important. The other thing that I think is going to be really foundational, I said that not everybody is going to be using these novel virtual reality headsets to be accessing these things. So when you look at virtual worlds that exist today, the majority of people are actually using them in 2D format, right? They're using them on tablets or Android phones or these kinds of things. And so making sure that we're thinking about developing for both platforms and in a way that developers can easily access, that's going to be really important. I think that the core problem is, the core situation is a lot of the experiences and technologies that I talked about earlier, they exist today in the world, right? So we have the ability to have a virtual experience where we can sit with avatars and talk to each other. That exists today. We have the ability to superimpose virtual content on a physical space in what we call mixed reality. That exists today. The challenge is really an economic one and to some extent a technical one of making it, making this technology so that it is easy and cheap enough to manufacture and that it's affordable for people around the world. And so I think that's the next frontier that we really need to think about in addition to the technical ones.
Sure, which makes super sense because, as you mentioned, that it has to be really something that can have the potential to be affordable and accessible for everyone worldwide. And now I think I'm moving to Carlos in another more interesting question regarding content moderation in the metaverse.
Thanks, Celina. And let me just send out a shout out to those who are watching us from YouTube and from the audience here. We are starting with a couple of questions that we have prepared for Rob, but we want to hear from you. So in due time, that will coming up quite shortly, we want to get your questions. So those who are watching us on YouTube, we are taking notes of your questions, and we will get them to Rob in a moment. And the same, I think, is true for the friends in our audience. But Rob, let me turn to an issue about content moderation on the metaverse and why that matters. I was reading recently an interview by Nick Clegg, the president from Meta of Global Affairs, And Nick was saying very interesting things. And first of all, he was saying that when I talk with someone by the phone, I tend to raise my voice. I don't know if that happens to you, but it happens to me a lot. When I am like speaking to someone through Zoom or any like web conferencing platforms, I tend to raise my voice, almost like I'm trying to be heard through the internet. So I have to speak like very loud. It's interesting that Nick was saying when I talk to someone using a metaverse platform, I tend to have my tone of voice like slightly relaxed. It doesn't look like I'm trying to make sure that the people hear me out from a distance. Because by the end of the day, distance might not be felt the very same way. And I think that remark on itself is quite powerful because it shows how the metaverse might change the way we interact with each other. And when we address issues of content moderation, I think there's an important topic here, which is how we are going to address this type of interaction. Is it something that resembles more what we have on social media, or is it something that resembles more the interactions that we have face-to-face without the interactions through screens? And the reason I'm asking you this is from a regulatory standpoint and from a content moderation standpoint, that's a very important question to make because the remark that Nick Clegg presents in this interview and in an essay that he recently wrote is that when we try to think about issues of content moderation in the metaverse, we tend to look to the metaverse as we look to social media. And when we think about social media, we're thinking about someone posting something, either a photo, a video, a text message. And then when you think about content moderation, you think about removal of this content and how you act upon this type of photo and video and something else. And Nick Lewood said, in the metaverse, that type of framework might seem a little bit wrong because most of the time we're talking about behavior and not about content. And in the way that people interact with each other, it resembles more the way that you do outside of the internet on a face-to-face type of meeting and conversation. I would love to get your reaction for that because I think that's something that seems to be something more ephemeral, even outside of the scope of the law and the regulatory debates. But I think that by the end of the day, it will matter on how regulators and policymakers end up deciding what the metaverse is and how they will regulate it. It will be like social media 2.0, or it's going to be something that resembles more interactions that we have on a face-to-face interactions.
Yeah, so Nick has a really good essay that he's posted on Medium that talks about a lot of these issues and that explores the question of governance of the metaverse and in the metaverse, and some of these ideas of who gets to decide what you get to say or how you can communicate. And I think the connection that you just made is a really interesting one between the kind of experience that you have in virtual spaces versus and how we think about something like content moderation. Because it's true that, when I post something online, I post a photo on my Facebook page, right? Then it's expected, it will exist, it's there, it's fixed in virtual space, and people can come back and read it. And of course those things will exist in the metaverse too, but the predominant way of interacting is going to be in real time. It's going to be ephemeral. It's going to be you and I sitting and having a conversation, and some of the attributes that I talked about earlier, the ability to have spatial relationships, the ability to make eye contact, the ability for me to gesture with my hands like this. These are all things that make the experience much more human and much more interpersonal, and they make us experience the interaction as a real world interaction. And so you can imagine a future where, as I said, we're all sitting in different places physically in the world, but we feel like we're together. And you can imagine, I might invite you over in my living room, and we have, again, this is technology that exists today. We could watch a video together, or I could pull up a document that I'm working on, and you could stand next to me and we could work on it together. These kinds of things are much more analogous to a physical interaction that we would have in the physical world. And so you have this question about what's the right way to think about moderation. I think most people, and I do this myself, and we are now doing virtual meetings in virtual conference rooms in our company. And when we do this, I experience it much more as a real world kind of interaction. And so the question becomes, is it the right thing is there such a thing as content removal in that world, right? So if you and I are saying something and a moderator comes in later, even if it were recorded, let's say, and a moderator comes and listens to it, there's no such thing as taking down that content. But from a privacy perspective, there's also the question of, do you want somebody to be listening to conversations all the time? Is it even feasible, right? So we talked earlier about there being one metaverse, not multiple metaverses. And if that's true, if I'm right about that, then it also means the metaverse will be decentralized. There will not be a single choke point where somebody could listen to all, even if this were a good idea, which I think it's not, where somebody could listen to every conversation that happened in the metaverse and decide in real time whether it's allowed or not allowed. It's just not a realistic outcome. So what does that mean instead? Certainly it doesn't mean that the metaverse is going to be in the US we use the expression the Wild West, but it doesn't mean that there's not going to be any kind of governance. But one of the things that Nick talked about in his essay, which I think is a really good analogy, he has this image of a house. And there's a foundation of a house, and there's a first floor of a house, and there's a second floor of the house. And that means that different entities will have different roles in governing what happens in the metaverse. And I think that also is very similar to the physical world today. So, we're here in a conference room in Rio, and we're all subject to Brazilian law. And regardless of where we're coming from, there's a baseline set of rules that apply. And we all have that. And then, we're in a building, and the hotel sets its own rules for what kind of behavior it considers acceptable. And then if we violate that, then the hotel security will come and make us leave. And then ITS also gets to decide in this space, in verandas, what are the norms of behavior and what's okay. And I think that the metaverse will be much more similar to that, where there are different entities that have different responsibilities, but I don't think it's desirable or even feasible for a company like Meta to decide for everybody on the internet, let's say, here's what you can say and here's how you can operate. There's not the technology or the concept of being able to do that. And so I do think it requires us to think about new and different solutions to behavior. And we've certainly been spending a lot of time internally thinking about that.
So thanks, Rob. I think, Celina, do you have a follow-up on that?
Sure. So following up on this characteristic of trying to mimic offline experiences in this virtual world, which leads us to, I think, some questions regarding also inclusion and how, for example, avatars could express how people's own identity, how to build, the whole spectrum can be built to be representative of the diversity we have here. And also, there's been some reports of harassments having been occurring in different metaverse spaces. So how can we take, since it's not exactly the same of being in this offline environment, how we can take the advantage of this to try and maybe put up some other safeguards to try and avoid that these kind of behavior that happens offline, that can be it's not transferred to this online mode, with the challenge that you want to try to mimic what everything you can do online, but with these extra safeguards.
So this idea of identity in the metaverse is a really important and foundational one, and one that we've actually been investing in first because it is so foundational to the rest of the experience. What do I mean by this? Well, you have this concept of an avatar that you can create that represents you in virtual space. And so a lot of the thought that we put into this is, what are the different ways that people might want to express themselves, that they might want to have different identities? And so it's things like, certainly what clothes you wear, what your hairstyle is, these kinds of things. But you can imagine lots of religious and cultural expression that people might want to have, their gender identity that they might want to have, whether people use a wheelchair, for example. These are all things that are really important and fundamental to who we express of ourselves in society. And so when you're building the concept of avatars, of how you present yourself to the virtual world, making sure that we represent that in a rich and meaningful way is important. And so one of the things that I'm actually most proud of in the way that we've approached this is we've approached the concept of avatars in an inclusive first way, so that a lot of these attributes are things that people optionally can choose to communicate about themselves. But it's also true, if most of us think about the way that we interact with the world, we actually have lots of different identities, right? So, the way that I identify myself in work might be a little different than the way that I identify myself with my kids or with my family or with my friends. I'm going to act differently when I'm out on the beach than when I'm here. That's all a part of being human in society. And so one of the things to also think about is, how do we give people the ability to, one, choose what version of their identity they want to express in a particular context or particular space, and two, take that expression with them when they move to different spaces. So again, going back to our metaverse or metaverses discussion, if I have an avatar and I'm in an ITS space, and then I move to a conference room at Meta's virtual headquarters in the metaverse, I should be able to be the same person and be recognized in the same way. And so that requires a lot of thinking about not just how do we build a taxonomy that lets people take their avatars with them and port their avatar into a different world, but also how do we make sure that that data that's associated with you, which is going to potentially, depending on what you express, be sensitive, make sure that we handle that responsibly. I think that also the connection that you're making also between identity expression and abuse or misconduct in the metaverse is also very analogous to physical spaces, right? And so, it's not the way that I would like the world to be, but it is true that people react and mistreat each other based on the way that they identify. And so I think that it's something that we just need to be realistic about. It's not human behavior that's going to go away because we're in a new space, but I do think that there are a lot of things that we can do. And one of the reasons why I'm glad that we're having these conversations now, because as we're building the technology, it's not I think the reference point that I always use is a physical experience, but there are some things that we can do in virtual spaces that give people more agency and more autonomy to do those things. So for example, we recently introduced in Horizon Worlds, which is our virtual worlds experience, the ability to have physical space. So you can say, I don't want people to come within a meter of me, for example. And that's not something that you can programmatically enforce in physical space. If somebody wants to enter your personal bubble in physical space, they have the ability to do that, even if you object to it. Whereas we can actually enforce that their avatar can't come close to you if you don't want them to. You have the ability to mute people and say, I want to be in this space, but I don't want to hear from this person. And we can all imagine how that would be really nice to do in some social conversations, to say, like, I just really don't want to hear from that guy. But so these kinds of things that allow people to have more agency over their experience are going to be really important. And I think we have to be very intentional about where we want to depart from the expectations that we have about the way that the physical world works. And I think this is an important place to do that.
Yeah, I think that's just this feature, I think, will lead many people to be excited to change and transport themselves to the metaverse.
Sure thing. And just to to reach back to people from YouTube. So we got a couple of questions on inappropriate behaviors and on data protection on the metaverse. Some of those topics Rob has already addressed here in this a couple of previous answers, but we'll get back to a couple of those topics in a later time. Let me just turn to the audience here in our live room. Do we have any questions from the audience at this time? I have a bunch of questions myself, but do we have any question or someone who wants to say something? So I would just ask for you to please say your name first and send a question. So
sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriela Maia. I'm a researcher here at ITS about metaverses. My question is about the personal space tool. We know that EU was developed aiming to prevent violence and harassment cases as it happened on beta testing. But if you keep in mind that the harassment doesn't need a physical experience to happen, because it happens at Facebook and Instagram, for example. What can be done to prevent and address these cases of harassment? And keeping in mind that harassment in the physical space can happen even if people and avatars aren't close, because it can be like contextual harassment. Thank you.
Yeah. It's really important. I think it's worth saying two things at the outset. One is nobody wants people. It's not good for us or for people if there are if there's harassment and bad experiences in the metaverse. And so I think doing the work that we can to try to address that up front is going to be really important. But it's also worth saying, as you're pointing out, this is human behavior, and so I don't want to pretend it won't happen. I mean, I think people misbehave in physical space. They misbehave on Instagram and Facebook and lots of other platforms, and I think that is something we have to contend with. In thinking about what are the ways to do it, you mentioned a couple that we've invested in already and that we've talked about, right? The ability to have a physical buffer between you and other people, the ability to mute people or to report people, those sorts of things. But I think there's more that we can do in terms of tooling and in terms of empowering the community to deal with situations involving harassment, in addition to whatever kinds of platform approaches we have. So one is, I talked earlier about the Nick Clegg's model of the house, where there are different layers that all play into it. I think most of us, just like in the physical world today, we go into other people's spaces. We go to an ITS space, or we go into an FGV space, or wherever we go. Giving the people who manage those spaces the ability to make decisions about what's going to be allowed there and to take action when people misbehave, so that there are real consequences and there's an ability for the director of ITS, a director of ITS, to say, okay, you violated the norms here, so we're not going to allow you into our space anymore. That I think is something that happens implicitly in physical space, and is something that we need to be intentional about building for virtual worlds, so that if ITS decides to create a virtual veranda, for example, that they have the ability to decide, we're going to invite people in, but we're also going to be here and see if people are misbehaving. We'll have the ability to ask them to leave. We'll have the ability to, potentially, if they do something that's really bad, bring in law enforcement and have them take accountability for something that violates the law. And I think those things are important too. So a lot of the foundational work that we're doing now is on how do we make sure that we have overall oversight and overall ability to set the right kinds of infrastructure in place, but then also to empower people who control spaces and who establish spaces to govern them and to moderate them, but then also to empower people to take action if they feel like they're being violated or harassed.
Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be in this meeting. I'm Fabricia, journalist and multimedia artist, resident of Baixada Fluminense, one of the peripheries of Brazil that has been most victimized by violence and climate change. So I'm a researcher and a producer on Visão Co-op, a cooperation network of platforms and green technologies. So I've brought two questions from our collective study of meaning, our collective study of meanings of metaverse. So here they are. First, in the city where I live, less than 40% of people have free access to internet. So most of plans don't allow opening links. For them, information sometimes are restricted to the headlines that appear on social media. People who had a deficient formal education are often the target audience for fake news. And the verification they consult is the opinion of peers in similar situations. Personalization algorithm and community formation have this challenge, the moderation of public debate. So how does Meta intend today to promote more equity in access to quality content? And second, Meta has recently announced that it is experimenting with NFT. This transition from Web 2 to 3.0 popularizes experience of distribution and participation that have the most interesting characteristics of network. Here at ITS, we have important studies of the use of blockchain and to distribute ownership over data produced online among digital identities. In addition to privacy rights, we can think of a property that experiences new aspects of cooperation on the digital, integrating content producers to the platform's business model. So how does Meta see the participation of users in the data economy and this new phase of the company?
Both really, really valuable questions. Thank you. On the first one about inclusion, I talked a little bit before about some of the ways that we are thinking about that, which include developing for a wide range of devices, not just high-end virtual reality headsets, and working on connectivity and access to spectrum, which I think over time are going to be really helpful. But I think that's the beginning rather than the end of the answer to your question, because you touched on something that I think is really foundational, which is the idea of education and the idea of giving people access to education. It's actually probably one of the areas that I'm most excited about in thinking about the promise of the metaverse. There are already, we've made a pretty big investment. We've spent about $150 million to fund education efforts around the world associated with the metaverse. And so there are already organizations that are building virtual twin campuses for universities. And so it means that you can have access to a world-class education even if you can't physically travel or you can't pay tuition. And so, again, very early in the evolution of these things, but the idea of giving people better access to and more democratized access to education, I think is a really important and powerful component of this. I think that also, when we think about, access to information and how people are able to communicate, I do think that there are there's a trade-off between giving people the agency to communicate what they want and the ability to make sure that high quality information exists. And so I think just like in the physical world, we'll see both of those. I do think that there's a role for people that curate spaces to play in identifying, what are the kinds of communications that we're going to allow here. I also think that we'll have judgments to make about what we want to recommend and what we want to encourage people to access. And so I think there's actually in addition to the content moderation questions that we also talked about, I think a really important piece of this is curation. And how do we think about, one, giving people access to high quality education and other experiences that we think are positive, and then also how do we make sure that as people are navigating, they have signposts for where to go for high quality information and for information that's going to enrich discourse and enrich their lives. Again, I think I'll go back to what I said before. I don't think it's going to be perfect. I think there are going to be these challenges because this is a part of human behavior, but I do think addressing it, early and having these conversations is a big part of it. And I do think starting early with education as opposed to fact-checking as the first answer is also an important piece of this. Turning to your question about NFTs and blockchain, I think very, very early days in what this looks like, but I think your question highlights a lot of the promise of this technology, both for people and giving them autonomy, and I think this idea of decentralized governance, and then also for monetization and economic opportunity. I mentioned earlier we were talking about the 4 areas that we feel like we really need to get right for the metaverse vision to be successful, and one of those is making sure that creators have the ability to earn a living. And so I think NFTs and virtual goods and virtual non-fungible ideas is going to be an important part of how people can earn a living. And so I think we're still early in understanding what that looks like and building that out. But the idea is if you're an artist and you create something, you want to have the ability to share it, but also to have people pay you for it. If you have a performance, you want to have the ability for people to buy a ticket and get access to it. But then also the attributes around how you want that content to behave is also something that needs to live with it. So you talked about data protection. I might create content that I really only want you as the recipient to be able to see, or I might want to share it with the world. And so a big part of how we have to think about both the concept of digital goods and NFTs and these kinds of things, but also the concept of interoperability that we were talking about before, is again thinking of those questions up front so that we can build in the taxonomies and the infrastructure to make sure that people can have the ability to get paid for creative work, but also that they can have choices about how it gets distributed.
Rob, let me get from creators to a question that we got from YouTube. So on YouTube, we have some comments on how brands could advertise and be present on the metaverse. So there are a couple of questions coming from YouTube. They're focusing mostly on a commercial aspect of the metaverse. But let me bundle this up with a question from myself, because I end up hearing a lot comparisons between the metaverse and Second Life. The now defunct way in which people interacted way ago. And there were I remember talking with someone from an advertisement agency saying like a lot of brands end up advertising on Second Life, and then Second Life simply disappeared. So how we make sure that the metaverse doesn't repeat the same history of Second Life? And what do you see that is different right now with the metaverse, with the technology, with societal change and the way we interact right now, that this comparison that we end up hearing a lot between those previous experiences that we have on interactions online, such as Second Life, why do they not translate to the metaverse? What is really different this time around?
So I think about I'll start actually by saying, I mean, I think the lesson from virtual worlds that came before is a really salient one, and it's something I think about a lot. And one of the reasons why actually a lot of the conversations that we're having today are so important is the best chance for the success of this vision is to make sure that we're having these conversations up front, that people have the ability to contribute to the creation of this idea in this space, and that we think about the choices that we need to make in the architecture of it, so that we can get ahead of some of these. And so I think just like social networks came and went in this, before Facebook there were other social networks, and there will be social networks in the future too. I think it's not a given that this stuff is going to exist and is going to be successful, and so we really do, like I take a huge amount of responsibility for my work and my team's work and the company's work, but also for all of our work to try to be as thoughtful as we can about this. I think one of the things that feels different to me in thinking about this is, obviously the technology, where, technology is much more advanced so that you can have a more rich, immersive, genuine kind of interaction. But more than that, I think it's that the point of this is not really to be a separate world, a virtual world that is removed from reality. And I think when you think about the way that we've thought about virtual worlds for the past decade, it's very much been that. Like, I'm going to go into this world and I'm going to have a separate space. And I think when you look at the concepts that exist today, it still feels a little bit that way. But if I think about the promise of the metaverse, it's not actually about taking us away from physical reality. It's not about taking us away from spaces where we interact. It's about enriching those experiences. So if I couldn't travel to Rio to be here, the ability to be here in a virtual conversation could be really powerful. If I didn't have the ability to see street art, because you wanted to have a digital creation and have it on the street corner, but the city of Rio won't let you do that. The ability to sort of have content that's out there that people can experience as an enhancement of their day-to-day experience. I think that's going to be important. And also this idea of interoperability. I mean, I really don't, it's not a throwaway line to say that the metaverse has to, in order for it to reach its full potential, has to be a metaverse that everybody contributes to. Because, in the same way that the internet was this big global experiment, where lots of different researchers and lots of different companies and lots of different governments came together to build something that was bigger than any one of them. That's what makes the internet successful. That's why the internet is not the same as, a bulletin board system or, something that people, in the, early, late 80s, 1990s was like the early iteration of the stuff was, was that. And the reason that the internet survived and those things didn't is because it was a global shared experience and a shared enterprise. And I hope that the metaverse will be that too, where it's not just a virtual world that one person or one company creates, but it's actually a shared enterprise that we're all creating together and that will be an enhancement on our ability to interact as a society.
Maybe just a follow-up on one of the points you were just saying. If you could explain a bit more, what are the promises and like which sectors do you believe that will be much more transformed, like in a positive way? There's like uses in the medical sector, like education. So what the metaverse will create a possibilities that it's not actually that does not exist right now, that can have a real impact on these specific areas.
So there are a number of areas where work is actually happening right now, and I think has a lot of promise for really improving people's lives in society. One I already talked about, which is education, and I talked about the virtual twin campuses, the idea of having a university education and where people can go in physical space, but they can also go in virtual space and see the same environment and listen to the same courses and these kinds of things. So I think that's really powerful. But there's also, there's an organization that is using virtual technology to deliver in-person education to elementary and secondary students. And when you think about math and science, one of the things that they realized is it takes actually children a long time to learn these concepts because a lot of us learn experientially, right? And so the ability to learn about math or science and actually be responsible for moving things around in physical space and seeing how those theoretical concepts apply to reality, it turns out actually improves educational outcomes for students and helps them learn more quickly and be more confident with their learning. That exists today. Workforce training. One of the things that is that is most exciting is the idea of upskilling and helping people gain additional professional skills to work in new trades, or to do things that are both high severity but also low frequency. So in other words, I can train, and manufacturing is a really good example of this, where companies are using virtual reality technology today to help people learn how to do manufacturing trades and how to get skilled at more advanced manufacturing jobs. So learning how to do things before you have to be on a line or before you have to actually be doing the job so that you can feel confident and be skilled at the mechanics of how to do it is really important. But also what to do when those situations happen that you can't anticipate and that maybe happen once in a career. How do you think about that? So thinking about how to deal with emergency response. Walmart in the United States actually did a training for employees to think about, Black Friday and the once a year sales where there's a lot of activity going on, and if you're new to the company, you might not be able to experience it, and to actually be able to simulate that and try to feel what it feels like is a really powerful example of this. And so I think these are a couple of examples. I think that the last that I'll mention is healthcare. During the pandemic, organizations were using virtual reality to help, and augmented reality as well, to help people learn how to use personal protective equipment, so masks and gowns and these kinds of things, and how to use them safely. But they're also starting to use virtual reality technology to train surgeons. So imagine you're doing a rare surgery. Children's Hospital, for example, is doing this, or you're doing a rare surgery on a child. You might not have ever done that in your career, and it's really important to get right the first time. So the ability to build a simulation and to practice it in virtual space before you ever touch a human body is also really, really important. So these are examples of things that exist today, but they're also extremely, extremely early. And then, the last thing that I'll mention, but I think you can see the promise of what this could become. The last thing I'll mention is just sort of the day-to-day experience of working. So we have this concept that we call infinite office, and it sounds a little, it sounds a little boring. Like, why would I want my office to be infinite? But when it comes, I mentioned that we do a lot of virtual collaboration at Meta, and so the ability to have a screen that I put up on the wall. And that you and I can look at together, and we can, even though this is something that was just very acute for a lot of us over the pandemic, the ability to not be able to collaborate together. So we can put up a screen on the wall, we can draw on a whiteboard, we can actually interact and collaborate. This is really important and valuable for most knowledge workers, but actually the place where it's most useful, I think it turns out, is in creation. So designing, if you want to design a virtual model or a virtual product of some sort, the ability to actually build it in a virtual space and walk around it and experience it as you're creating it and say, oh, I want this to move over here. These kinds of ability is just adds a different dimension to the creative process that most of us wouldn't have experienced before. So I think there's a lot of different directions that it could go in, but I think we're on the very early side of people figuring out how they'll use it.
Thank you. Super interesting. Maybe we'll have just another.
Yeah, I think I have a question from YouTube, and since we're almost running out of time, but let me get this one. So Renata from YouTube was asking about what do you see as major challenges for privacy and data protection on the metaverse? I know that we have addressed some of those topics, but on a broad view, what do you see as the biggest challenges that we have ahead looking on data protection?
I mean, it won't surprise you that I spend a lot of time thinking about these questions, and as I said, it's one of the big areas that we've decided are critical to get right. One thing that I think about is this isn't a greenfield set of questions, because we have, here in Brazil, we have LGPD, we have existing privacy laws that give us the principles that we need to think about. And so it's not like we're starting from scratch. We understand the basic ways to understand what privacy rights should look like in the metaverse. And I think it's important that people be able to have those privacy rights and that we think about them in building the architecture. And so, questions like, how should we think about data subject access, or how should we think about, transparency and giving people information about how their information is going to be used? These are all questions that exist already. But there are some new areas that are important to think about. One example is for higher end headsets, the virtual reality headset, or in the future smart glasses that might exist. They have to, in order to work, have cameras facing outward, They have to have the ability to collect information about what's going on in the environment so that they can provide the service that people want or to maintain safety. So for example, on my Meta Quest 2 headset, it maps my room to make sure that I don't walk into the wall because I have a headset on my face. And so obviously very important from a safety perspective, but also really sensitive from a privacy perspective. So how we thought about doing this is using the concept of point clouds. So what your device does, it has a camera on the outside, but what it's actually doing is it's looking at the edges of objects. And so it's mapping out, okay, if the purpose is to make sure that Rob doesn't walk into a wall, let's figure out where the walls are. And it doesn't need to send to the server a full video or image of your entire room. It just needs to know where the things are that you shouldn't walk into. And so the ability to do things like that, that use data in ways that are appropriate and responsible and needed for the service, but that don't over-collect data or overuse data, that's really important. As a part of our Ray-Ban Stories product, which is smart glasses that have cameras and allow you to take a first-person view of what's going on in the world around you, there's a light on them that comes on. If somebody tries to, so it's the same as the camera that you would have on your phone, except it's in your glasses. So people aren't used to this, and so we thought a lot about how to make sure that people understand when they're being recorded. Just like if I were to take my phone and hold it up, you would understand that I'm recording you. So you have to take an explicit action to turn it on, so people will see me turn it on, or I'll have to make a verbal command to turn on recording. There's a noise that happens, so everybody around hears that, and then there's lights that come on. There's a light that comes on the device, so anybody who's looking at me knows this device is on and it's recording. I think these are the kinds of questions that we're going to have to think about, where the technology is a little bit different and the concept is a little bit different, to make sure that we're bridging the privacy expectations that we have in the physical world into the into the virtual world. The last thing I'll say is I do think that, like we were talking about in some other contexts, I really use the physical world as a reference point for how we should think about privacy expectations, right? And so that means, when we're standing in a room and there's somebody, 5 feet away from us, those people, we can expect that those people will be able to hear what's going on in the room. It's not necessarily expected that somebody who's, 5 kilometers away is going to hear what's going on in the room. And so we all as humans have an instinctive understanding of who's going to be able to hear our conversations. We see somebody, they're standing very close to us, versus we don't see somebody and they're, they're kilometers away. And so these kinds of concepts can also help guide where do we have an instinctive understanding of how our data gets processed, and where are the things where if we build technology that deviates from that, we need to do some extra work to make sure people understand it and choose it as a part of their experience.
All right, then. Rob, thanks for that. That was, I think, a really insightful conversation on what we can see ahead from the metaverse, and I believe we all have more information right now on how we engage on several topics related to the metaverse. But I'm afraid we're running really short on time, so I have to cut it short, unfortunately, our conversation. I had a bunch of questions I would love to turn to you, but I think we'll have some time here in the room as well for people to interact and make questions. But Rob, I realized that yesterday you went to dinner and you tried Guaraná, which is a very popular drink in Brazil, and you felt that it was a little bit too sweet for your taste. So I think my final question to you will be, do you think in the metaverse there will be Guaraná and it will be as sweet as it is in real life?
I think a Brazilian chef will have to create virtual Guaraná, and we'll have to be able to dial the sweetness up and down, which will be something that we can't do in physical world. But I really appreciate this conversation. I think I can tell from just the conversation that we've had today that it's the beginning of a lot of discussions about a lot of these things, including virtual beverages. And so I'm hoping that we'll be able to continue the conversation both here in Rio and then also in virtual space where we can drink together.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your online experience here in Brazil.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
And thanks, everyone.